They gave me the couch at Christmas. Grandma doesn't need a bed, they said. She's used to discomfort. So, I slept quietly. What they didn't know, the deed to the entire vacation cabin was in my name, and that year was the last. I invited them. My name is Agnes, and for 50 years, the scent of pine needles and damp earth has been synonymous with family, with love, with Christmas. It's the scent of the cabin, a beautiful, rustic A-frame nestled on the shore of a quiet lake in northern Michigan. My late husband, Frank, built it with his own 2 hands. He laid every floorboard, raised every beam, and built the great stone fireplace that has been the heart of our family's holiday gatherings for as long as I can remember. He used to say the cabin wasn't made of wood and stone, but of memories. After he passed away 5 years ago, the cabin became my most precious possession, a sanctuary where I felt closest to him, a legacy I intended to pass down through the generations. Frank was a practical man. A few years before he died, he sat me down at the sturdy oak table he'd also built. He pushed a folder across the table. "Aggie," he'd said, his voice serious, "I've put the cabin solely in your name. The deed is clear. It's yours, and yours alone. I want you to have that security no matter what. Don't need to mention it to the kids. No sense in them getting ahead of themselves." I hadn't understood the full weight of his foresight then. I'd simply seen it as a loving, protective gesture. I put the deed in our safe deposit box and rarely thought of it again. The cabin belonged to the family, as far as I was concerned. Every December, I'd make the long drive up from my small suburban home, arriving a week before my son, David, his wife, Susan, and my 2 teenage grandchildren, Chloe and Leo. I'd spend that week airing out the rooms, battling the ever-present dust, and filling the pantry and refrigerator with all their favorite things. I'd chop wood for the fireplace, string lights on the porch, and put up the same motley collection of handmade ornaments we'd used since David was a boy. The work was hard on my 72-year-old bones, but the thought of having my family all together under that roof, of hearing their laughter echo through the pines, was my fuel. It was the centerpiece of my year, the tradition that made my solitary life feel full. This year started no differently. I arrived to the familiar, comforting chill of the unopened cabin and set to work. By the time they were due to arrive on Christmas Eve, the entire place was aglow. A fire roared in the hearth, a pot of my famous beef stew simmered on the stove, and the scent of cinnamon and cloves hung in the air. Their car crunched up the gravel driveway just after dusk. The reunion was a flurry of hugs, laughter, and the noisy chaos of luggage and presents being brought in from the cold. David, my son, gave me a warm, if brief, hug. Chloe and Leo, my grandchildren, were already absorbed in their phones, but they gave me distracted pecks on the cheek. It was my daughter-in-law, Susan, who seemed to be orchestrating everything, a whirlwind of brisk energy and organizational zeal. After dinner, as we sat by the fire, Susan clapped her hands together. "Okay, sleeping arrangements," she announced, brightly. "David and I will take the master bedroom, of course. Chloe and Leo, you have your room with the twin beds. And Chloe, your friend Maya is driving up tomorrow to stay for a couple of days, which will be so fun. She can take the small guest room with the double bed." I listened, a small knot of confusion tightening in my stomach. 3 bedrooms, all assigned. I waited for her to realize her miscalculation. David was the one who noticed my silence. Honey," he said tentatively to Susan. "What about Mom?" Susan turned to me, her smile unwavering, as if the solution were the most obvious thing in the world. "Oh, Grandma will be fine on the pull-out couch in here, won't you?" she said. It wasn't really a question. "It's actually quite comfortable, and you'll have the fire to keep you warm." The knot in my stomach turned to a block of ice. The couch. The lumpy 30-year-old pull-out sofa with a mattress as thin as a pancake and a metal bar that dug directly into the lower back. I had slept on it once, years ago, when we'd had a full house of relatives, and I'd woken up feeling like I'd been in a wrestling match. "Well," I started, trying to find the words. "It'll be fine," Susan said, cutting me off. With a cheerful wave of her hand, she turned to her husband. "Your mom is tough as nails. She's used to discomfort. It's not like she needs a fancy bed. She's used to discomfort." The words, spoken so casually, so openly, landed with the force of a physical blow. They echoed in the cozy, fire-lit room, a room I had single-handedly prepared for their comfort. I looked at my son, waiting for him, to object, to defend me. He just shifted uncomfortably, a weak, apologetic smile on his face. He wouldn't challenge her. He never did. Used to discomfort. Was that how they saw me? Not as a person, not as their mother and grandmother, but as a hardy old appliance, a creature of a bygone era who didn't require basic considerations like a proper bed. I thought of the arthritis in my hips, the ache in my back that was a constant companion, the nights I had to get up to stretch my stiff joints. I never complained. It was not my way. My generation was taught to endure, to put others first, to be resilient. And I saw now that my resilience, my quiet endurance, had been misinterpreted as an immunity to pain, an indifference to comfort. They had taken my strength and used it as an excuse for their own thoughtlessness. My life hadn't been easy. I'd raised a child on a tight budget, cared for my own aging parents, and nursed Frank through his final difficult illness. Yes, I was used to shouldering burdens, but I had never grown used to being treated as one. A lifetime of love and service welled up in me, a silent scream of protest. But the face I showed them was calm. I summoned a small, tight smile. "Of course, dear," I said, my voice sounding distant to my own ears. "The couch will be perfectly fine. It will be an adventure." "See? I told you," Susan said, beaming, her problem solved. "Grandma's a great sport." Later that night, after they had all retired to their warm, comfortable bedrooms, the master bedroom with its soft mattress, the twin beds in the kids' room, the cozy double bed in the guest room now awaiting Chloe's friend, I was left alone in the main room. The fire had died down to glowing embers. I pulled out the old sofa bed, the springs groaning in protest. The mattress, as I remembered, was a lumpy disgrace. I laid down, fully dressed, pulling a thin afghan over myself, the bar pressed into my spine. A cold draft snaked its way across the floor. Every bone in my body seemed to ache in advance, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the cold, hard clarity that was settling over my heart. They had made my role in this family perfectly clear. I was the help, the fixture, the one who could be put on the couch because my comfort was optional, a luxury that came after everyone else's, including a guest I didn't even know. I lay there in the darkness of the cabin my husband had built for me, for us. I listened to the wind whistling through the pines outside. I thought about the deed to this entire property, this valuable piece of land, this house filled with memories, sitting in a safe deposit box with my name, and my name alone, on it. They were sleeping soundly in my house, in my beds, while I was relegated to the couch like a piece of unwanted luggage. This was the last time I thought, the decision forming not in anger, but with the cold, undeniable force of truth. This was the last Christmas I would ever invite them to my cabin. They believed I was used to discomfort. I would not subject myself to this particular discomfort, the discomfort of being invisible in my own home, in my own family, ever again. The first morning after my banishment to the couch was a study in the quiet indignities of being rendered invisible. I woke before anyone else, not from a restful sleep, but because the sun was streaming into the main room and the bar in the pub. Sofa bed was pressing into my spine with the insistence of a dull metal finger. Every joint in my body protested as I slowly, carefully folded myself into a sitting position. My back screamed in silent rebellion. The simple act of getting up felt like a monumental effort. Before I could even make a cup of tea or use the bathroom in peace, I had to transform my bed back into a couch, erasing any evidence of my uncomfortable night to make the living room presentable for the family who were still sleeping soundly in their warm, private rooms. I smoothed the cushions, folded the thin afghan, and became, once again, just a grandmother sitting by a cold hearth, waiting for her family to begin their day. The next few days leading up to Christmas unfolded in a similar pattern. I was a performer in a play I hadn't auditioned for, playing the role of the cheerful, resilient matriarch while feeling like a displaced person in my own home. I cooked the meals, my back aching as I stood at the stove. I stoked the fire. I listened to their plans for the day, skiing for the kids, a trip into the small town for Susan, and simply nodded, knowing I would be left behind to mind the cabin. They didn't ask out of malice. They simply didn't ask at all. My participation was assumed to be in a support capacity. From my seat on the couch, I became a quiet observer, and what I saw was devastating in its clarity. I saw the way Susan would direct me, with a pleasant but firm tone, to find a particular board game or fetch a snack, as if I were a long-serving, slightly forgetful member of the household staff. I saw the way my son, David, would avoid my gaze. After one of these small slights, his discomfort a weak and useless substitute for intervention. He loved me, I knew, but he loved a quiet life more, and maintaining that quiet meant placating his wife, even at my expense. I watched my grandchildren, Chloe and Leo, who I adored, interact with me as a benevolent fixture. They'd ask me where the extra blankets were, or if there were any cookies left. But they wouldn't ask me about my day, about my life, about the stories this cabin held. To them, I was the keeper of the cookies, the source of answers, a part of the cabin's infrastructure, like the plumbing or the electricity. The guest, Chloe's friend Maya, arrived on Christmas Eve afternoon. She was a sweet girl who was given the comfortable guest room without a second thought. She thanked me profusely for my hospitality, completely unaware that I was the one person in the house who had none. That evening, I tried to reclaim a piece of our history. "Remember, David," I said as we sat around the fire, "how your father and I used to take you all out on the lake in the canoe on Christmas morning, right after opening presents? We'd paddle out to the little island. We could do that tomorrow morning," Susan answered before he could. "Oh, I don't think so, Agnes," she said with a dismissive little laugh. "It's freezing out, and the kids will want to play with their new things. Besides, we're having a big brunch. We can't be out on the lake." She turned to Chloe and Maya. "Your grandmother is an old-school tough cookie." The tradition was vetoed. My memory brushed aside as a quaint, impractical notion. It was another small cut, another reminder that my history in this house was being overwritten. Christmas morning was a flurry of wrapping paper and feigned excitement on my part. I received a new pair of sensible slippers from David and Susan, and a generic world's best grandma mug from the kids. Gifts chosen from a sense of obligation, not intimacy. I watched as they opened the thoughtful presents I had spent weeks choosing for them, my heart aching with the disconnect between my love for them and their casual disregard for me. The rest of the day passed in a blur of my own activity. I cooked the grand Christmas dinner, a 20-pound turkey with all the trimmings. I served, I cleared, I washed dishes until my hands were raw and my back felt like it might split in two. All the while, I maintained my smile, my pleasant demeanor. I was the ghost of Christmas past, present, and future, haunting the edges of their celebration, ensuring its smooth operation while being completely unseen. That night, lying on the lumpy couch for the final time, the physical pain was a dull roar, but my mind was sharp and clear. I thought about Frank. I remembered the day he'd signed the deed over to me. "This place is your heart's home, Aggie," he'd said. "I want to make sure it always stays that way, that it's always your decision what happens here." His foresight, which had seemed merely loving at the time, now felt like a profound, life-altering gift. He had seen a future I could not, and he had given me the power to navigate it. My family saw this cabin as a free hotel where they were, the privileged guests. They had forgotten that it was, first and foremost, my home. My decision, made in the dark on that first night, now felt not just right, but necessary. The day they left was bright and cold. The car was packed, the goodbyes cheerful and oblivious. "Thanks for everything, Mom. The best Christmas yet," David said, giving me a quick hug. "You were such a trooper on that couch, Agnes," Susan added with a wink, as if we'd shared a funny secret. "We so appreciate it." I just smiled and waved as they drove away, their car disappearing down the long, pine-lined driveway. I stood on the porch until the sound of their engine faded completely. Then, the smile dropped from my face. I walked back inside, the festive debris of their visit surrounding me like wreckage from a storm. The scent of their presence was everywhere. The first thing I did was walk to the master bedroom, their bedroom. I stripped the sheets from the bed, the ones Susan had slept on, and threw them in a heap on the floor. I opened the windows wide, letting the sharp, clean, icy air pour in, chasing out the last vestiges of their presence. I walked through every room of the house, my house, and saw it with new eyes. It was no longer a vessel for their holiday expectations. It was a silent testament to the life Frank and I had built. It was my sanctuary, and it had been desecrated by casual disrespect. I went to the kitchen and made myself a pot of strong black coffee. I sat down at the heavy oak table, the one Frank had built, the one where my family had just celebrated a Christmas I would never forget, for all the wrong reasons. The deep, aching sadness was still there, a wound that would take a long time to heal. But alongside it, a new feeling was rising, a powerful, quiet, liberating sense of purpose. I took out a notepad and a pen. I wrote a heading at the top of the page, "The Future of the Cabin." Underneath, I began a list. Call a locksmith. Change all the locks. Immediately. They had a key they had proven they were no longer entitled to. Contact my lawyer. Discuss the deed, the will, and setting up a new trust. The cabin's future, its legacy, would no longer automatically flow to them. It would be protected, it would be mine to direct. Cleanse the space. I would spend the next week packing, away every sign of them, every photo, every childhood drawing pinned to the wall. I needed to reclaim the space as my own. Make a new plan for next Christmas. Not a lonely one, but one filled with people who would appreciate the gift of being there. I looked at my list. It was a Declaration of Independence written at age 72. The road ahead was uncertain. The confrontation that was likely to come would be painful. But for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't just the accommodating, resilient, uncomfortable grandmother on the couch. I was Agnes, the owner of this house, the master of my own comfort, and the architect of my own future. And that future would not be spent on a pull-out sofa. The week after my family left the cabin was one of profound and purposeful action. The silence they left behind was no longer an empty ache. It was a blank canvas. On Monday morning, my first call was not to a friend to lament my situation, but to a locksmith in the nearest town. A cheerful young man arrived that afternoon. As he replaced the old lock on the heavy oak door with a new, solid deadbolt, the metallic click of it sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a boundary being set in steel. The spare key my son, David, had carried on his keychain for 20 years was now just a useless piece of metal. My next call was to my lawyer. Arthur was a kind, steady man who had handled our affairs for years. I drove to his office the following day. The original deed to the cabin, crisp and official in its folder, sitting on the passenger seat beside me. I explained the events of Christmas to him, not with anger or tears, but with a calm, factual precision. I told him about the couch, about the casual dismissal, about the phrase, used to discomfort. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled, his expression revealing nothing but professional empathy. When I was finished, he simply said, "I see. And what would you like to do, Agnes?" "I want to secure the future of the cabin," I said. "My husband, Frank, left it to me to ensure its protection. I now see that protecting it means protecting it from my own family's sense of entitlement. I want to set up a trust. We spend the next several hours mapping out a new future for the place Frank had built. My will, which had left the cabin and the bulk of my estate to David and his children, was to be completely redrafted. The cabin would be placed into a charitable trust upon my death, the Frank and Agnes Legacy Retreat. Its new purpose would be to provide a free, quiet place for artists, writers, and musicians, people dedicated to creating beauty in the world, to come for 2-week residencies to work on their craft. The rest of my estate would form the endowment to fund its upkeep in perpetuity." "This is a profound change, Agnes," Arthur cautioned gently. "It's a disinheritance, in effect." "No," I corrected him. "It's a reinheritance. I'm leaving the cabin to a family of people who will see it as the sacred gift it is, not as a free hotel they are owed every summer. My son and his wife, they value transactions. This is the result of that transaction. They traded a lifetime of memories and a future legacy for a comfortable guest room for their daughter's friend. I am simply honoring the terms of the deal. They initiated." The winter months passed slowly. I stayed at the cabin, making it my own in a way I never had before. I packed away the photographs of David and Susan, the school pictures of the grandchildren. It was too painful to see their smiling, oblivious faces. I replaced them with photos of Frank, of my own parents, of the wild, beautiful landscape outside my windows. I retrieved my favorite books from storage, my own pottery, the colorful textiles I'd collected on my travels with Frank. The house began to reflect me, my history, my tastes. The process was a quiet, solitary act of healing, of reclaiming my own identity within the walls I had always shared. Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing the forest back to life. With it came the inevitable phone call from my son. "Hey, Mom," David said, his voice breezy and casual. "Just wanted to start thinking about the summer. We were thinking the first 2 weeks of July would be perfect for us to come up to the cabin. Is that good for you?" The casual assumption, the complete lack of awareness was still staggering. I took a steadying breath. "I'm afraid that won't be possible this year, David," I said, my voice polite but firm. There was a surprised silence on the other end. "Not possible? Why? Is something wrong with the cabin?" "The cabin is fine," I said. "It's just not available." "What do you mean, not available?" he asked, a note of irritation creeping into his tone. "It's our family cabin. We always come in July. The kids are already looking forward to it." "I understand that was the tradition," I said, "but traditions can change. I have other plans for the cabin this summer." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The conversation ended with his frustrated confusion hanging in the air. I knew what would happen next. I knew their sense of ownership would override my words. 2 weeks later, on a sunny Friday afternoon, I saw their familiar SUV pull up my long gravel driveway. I was sitting on the porch, reading a book, a cup of tea by my side. I didn't get up. They all piled out, David, Susan, and the kids looking annoyed. "Mom, what's going on?" David said as he approached the porch. "Your phone has been going straight to voicemail." "I've been enjoying the quiet," I said. "Well, we tried the key and it's not working," Susan said, her voice sharp with accusation. "Did you change the lock?" "I did," I confirmed. They stared at me, dumbfounded. It was Susan who finally found her voice, her face a mask of indignation. "You locked us out? Of our own family cabin? What on earth for, Agnes?" I placed my book down and looked at them. My family, standing on the gravel path like petulant, uninvited guests. "That's where you are mistaken, Susan," I said calmly. "It is not your family cabin. It is my cabin. Frank left it to me, and me alone. The deed, the title, every legal document is in my name." The shock on their faces was absolute. David looked pale. Susan's mouth opened and closed silently. That's not possible," David stammered. "It is the truth," I said. "And after the profound lack of respect you showed me in my own home last Christmas, I have decided to make a change. I decided that I will no longer host people who consider my comfort an afterthought. I will no longer open my home to people who believe I am used to discomfort." I let the words land, the echo of their own careless phrase in the quiet afternoon air. "Mom, that was a misunderstanding," David said weakly. "We didn't mean it like that." "Didn't you?" I asked, my gaze unwavering. It felt quite clear to me. When you put your 72-year-old mother on a lumpy sofa bed so your granddaughter's friend could have a comfortable room, you made your priorities perfectly clear. The problem is, you made those priorities clear in a house that you mistakenly believed was yours to do with as you pleased. "So what is this?" Susan spat, her shock turning to anger. "You're punishing us? You're kicking us out forever?" "This isn't a punishment," I said, and I felt the truth of it deep in my bones. "It is a consequence. It is the end result of a choice you made. You chose to treat me with disrespect. I am now choosing to surround myself with respect. This cabin, this beautiful place Frank built, will now be used for that purpose. I've established a trust. It's going to be a residency for artists and writers, a place for quiet creation and gratitude. Its gift will no longer be taken for..." Granted, they stood there, utterly defeated, the ground cut out from under them. The free family vacations, the valuable property they had assumed would one day be theirs, it was all gone. And it was gone not because of a tragedy or a financial crisis, but because of a couch, because of a single, thoughtless, deeply revealing moment of disrespect. "You are welcome to visit me in my home in the city if you choose," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "Our relationship is a separate matter that we may or may not be able to repair. But your time here, in this cabin is over. I stood up, picked up my teacup, and walked to the door. I'm sorry you drove all this way for nothing, I said before closing the door, the click of the new lock sounding like the final word in a long, painful chapter. I walked to the window and watched as my family, my confused, angry, uninvited family, got back into their car and, for the last time, drove away. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt the quiet, solid ground of my own self-respect beneath my feet.